In the 1960s and the 80s, the Soviet Union was like a huge pot of political and social change, especially in places like Kazakhstan. After the harsh Stalinist years, when Russification was almost like a law of nature, a thaw began in the 50s and the 60s. Think of it as a short break in tension when places like Kazakhstan could finally take a breath and even show their culture. But it wasn't really like that. The Soviet government kept tightening control, pushing socialist ideas and the Russian language to stay in charge. And that's where things get interesting. Despite the pressure, Kazakh intellectuals, artists and activists started to make waves. They brought back memories of their roots, culture and the language to the people of Kazakhstan. Artists, writers and the musicians worked in a way that sometimes even slipped past the authorities, letting the spark of national revival spread through official channels. This is a story of how people, despite the pressure, found their unique voice and began to revive their culture in the Soviet Union, and how it all looked against the backdrop of the powerful socialist machine. Statement number 1. Kazakh cultural revival in literature, language and the arts was a key factor in awakening national identity. Imagine this: Kazakhstan in the 60s, a land rich in ancient traditions but weighed down by Soviet rule for decades. It seemed everything was under control, but something was starting to boil under the surface. Don't just boil over, a real cultural revolution. Kazakh literature, language and art seemed to wake up after a long winter, and along with them, national awareness came alive. Writers like A.КЕКИЛЬБАЕВа and Togzhan Rakanova led this movement. In the 60s and the 80s, their work breathed new life into Kazakh literature, but this was more than a literary revival. They delved deep into the soul of Kazakh culture. In his Ballad of Forgotten Years, Kekilbaev mixed legends with modern dams, prompting people to think about who they are and where they came from. Meanwhile, S.SANBAEVA used old Kazakh motifs not just for style, but as a true way to rebuild the connection to the past that Soviet ideology had nearly erased. "Folklore isn't just a decoration for me," said S.SANBAEVA. "It's the key to understanding our people, their roots and the spirit passed down through generations. Myths and the legends help us remember the past and know ourselves in the present." But it wasn't only about myths. It was about reviving the nation and restoring pride, so Kazakhs could feel united again. The cultural revival of the 60s and the 80s wasn't just about the past. It was also for the future. It was like a time machine. Through books, art and the language, Kazakhs rediscovered their identity and prepared for a new era. Writer Ayagul Ablaikyzy called it not just a collection of works, but a real movement where each story declared, "We are here and we have a future." Statement number 2. Soviet policies both suppressed Kazakh identity and, strangely enough, helped it grow. Let's look at how Soviet policy in the 60s and the 80s not only suppressed, but also paradoxically helped the development of the Kazakh national identity. At first, the Soviet government tried to control Kazakh culture by enforcing the Russian language and the Soviet ideals. The traditional Kazakh lifestyle suffered greatly. The policy of collectivization starting in the 30s led to a famine that killed nearly 1.8 million Kazakhs, leaving a deep scar on the people's memory. As nomadic ways were dismantled, many Kazakhs moved to cities, losing touch with their roots. Stalin's repressions weakened the Kazakh intelligentsia, removing many cultural leaders. Yet this pressure created a stronger desire for Kazakh education, which boosted the Kazakh people's confidence and determination. Statement number 3. National political events, particularly the 1986 December protests, catalyzed a surge in national and resistance to Soviet control. When Kazakhstan's national identity began to awaken under Soviet rule, it seemed calm but steady. The Soviet regime tried to erase ethnic differences, and Kazakhstan was not the exception. Russia took over schools, jobs and the government, pushing much of Kazakh culture into the background. Yet beneath the Soviet sameness, Kazakh identity was quietly transforming. It began in the 60s, as Kazakh intellectuals started to reconnect with their past, like the era of the Kazakh Khanate. This movement was quite strong, laying a foundation for a new Kazakh identity that stood against Soviet internationalism. By the 70s, this cultural struggle had gained momentum. Although the Kazakhstan language was being pushed aside, it was still cherished in rural areas. Poets, writers and scientists worked hard to preserve the language and the traditions, filling Kazakhs with pride. The USSR seemed intent to blending everyone into the Soviet identity, but Kazakhs began to push back. Historians even coined the term vindictive Kazakhization to describe how Kazakhs tried to counter years of Russification. Then came Желтоқсан. In December 1986, young Kazakhs protested when Gennady Kolbin, a leader with no local ties, was appointed over them. Thousands took to the streets, not just because of a new leader, but to stand against years of cultural repression. It was the moment Kazakhs declared enough. Although the protests were crushed, they deeply changed how Kazakhs saw themselves. For the first time, they showed they were no longer willing to accept Soviet rule or the erasure of their culture. In the end, the national identity that was being suppressed became a powerful force of change that prepared Kazakhstan for independence in 1991. In general, the awakening of Kazakh identity was influenced by many factors, especially the political bold movements of the people, which forced people to remember the roots of their culture and respect themselves first of all.